Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Supergirl fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to build the all-media Luthor family tree is the host of the Krypton Report podcast, returning guest, Tyler Patrick. Welcome back.
Hey, thank you. I'm excited to do this. When you brought this up, you kind of pitched it to me as like a companion to our Lex Luthor's henchman. And I was like, yeah, this would be really neat because especially when you get into the post and pre-crisis where things got a little mucky, it's interesting to think about.
Yeah. So on that note, we did a great episode on your podcast a little while back on Lex's various henchmen. It was a lot of fun. I hope people will check that out if they haven't already. I've had this episode on my list for a long time, and honestly, I was planning to hit it in advance of Man of Tomorrow, which is set to feature Lex Luthor heavily, but I was a little too excited, and I was like, let's do it now. And if anyone's wondering why do it in the midst of Supergirl coverage, it felt appropriate given how large characters like Lena Luthor in particular, as well as Nasty Luthor, loom in these Supergirl stories. So it felt appropriate to hit it here. And I know normally when we do an episode like this, I issue the disclaimer that we're trying to be robust, but not exhaustive. For this one, I'm trying not to set myself up for failure here, but my goal really was to be as complete as possible and assemble the most thorough Luthor family tree that we could. Now, within that, we purposely did not dive into imaginary stories or Elseworld stories, but we looked at stories that were in continuity, at least when they were published, even if later on then they were no longer in continuity, and we looked at other media as well. Mm-hmm. So if we missed something, reach out, let us know, but at the same time, don't come at me with some random Elseworld story and be like, oh, he had this relative there, because we were purposely excluding that.
We're trying to stay to the prime Earth, because one of the things I thought about sending you was like, oh, in the absolute universe, they just showed that Lex has a wife and children. But I was like, that's Elseworlds.
The fear is that there's something so obvious that we're missing and that we're going to get done. And I'm going to be like, damn it.
And then you're like, how can we splice this back in?
Yeah, if it comes to that, maybe we will. So I have really just one kind of big picture question before we start putting together this family tree. Now, obviously, there's no one story that includes all of the relatives you and I are going to talk about. And I'd be surprised if we ever saw a story quite like that. Because when we put together this full list, people will see it's quite robust. At the same time, this whole idea of relatives for Lex, I guess, how does it sit with you? How far do you like to see his family tree extended? How many relatives do you want floating around in his orbit?
I think it works. Lex to me is a man who keeps things tight. So I think that even like we've seen, the Lex doesn't want family ties as much. He wants to stand up more on his own. The continuity parts will kind of throws this, but I don't want a whole huge Luthor family tree, a Luthor dynasty, because I feel like that gets muddy, and I think that's not who Lex is. And I feel like Lex would be the person, if he did have relatives, somehow they would all go missing.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that I like the family tree to be kept relatively small and contained for the reasons you said. I want the spotlight to be on Lex himself. At the same time, there's a part of me that says there's probably a Luthor version of Succession that would be really captivating to watch.
I feel like you kind of played with that on Smallville.
Right.
Not jumping ahead too much, but where Lionel took almost a Lex-esque role that we had never really seen before, and some of the pre-crisis Lex stuff was given to him.
But at the same time, overall, like I said, I prefer to keep it relatively tight as far as this family tree. And then thematically, I was thinking about what these relatives accomplish from a story and character perspective. What do they bring to light? What do they highlight about Lex's character? And I kind of identified three main themes or categories. I feel like when we're looking at his parents, specifically from the post-crisis landscape forward, there's some level of physical and or emotional abuse, and it helps account in whole or in part for why Lex ended up the way that he did. Then there's a character like Lena, his sister, and we're going to talk about her and her various permutations. And I'm thinking specifically of the comic book version of Lena Luthor. And I feel like there she represents this remaining tether to his humanity and to his past, to this upbringing that he's trying to put behind him. So I feel like that's sort of another avenue to explore. And then I feel like particularly with his wives and children, on the one hand, they do sometimes create an opportunity to show Lex's softer side, but I think beyond that, what they often tend to show is the limitations of his redemptive capabilities. Because there will be these instances where it seems like maybe he's turning over a new leaf and embracing the good that's still within him. But there's this other part, this hatred for Superman that he just can't shake. And we see that with Lex Luthor Jr. on Lexor in the Bronze Age. And we see that with baby Lena in the Y2K storyline. We see this in numerous instances with his bride, Lana Lang, on Smallville. It's not that there's no love there, but it's not a love that can be expressed truly and purely and without these other motives. So I feel like for me, kind of looking at the whole picture of this, those were kind of the three main avenues that kind of popped out at me.
I agree. And I have more to say as we get into the specifics of how the relatives are used depending on the story in which they're a part of. And I think especially when we get to Smallville. I think that's probably one of the biggest, because you have a through line of what that meant. And that's your biggest dynamic that we got.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's dive in here. Let's start putting together this family tree. I'd like to start with the parents. And then once we've done the parents, we can actually go back and identify some of the ancestors. But let's start with the parents to kind of dive in here. So pre-crisis, we have Jules and Arlene Luthor, who don't have all that much to do in the pre-crisis landscape. In Adventure Comics 271 in 1960, that's where we get this new backstory for Superboy and Lex in Smallville. We don't see Lex's parents, nor are they named, but there is a reference to Lex's father being a traveling salesman. Then, not too long thereafter, in Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane number 23 in 1961, that's the debut appearance of Lena Thorell, aka Lena Luthor. And we find out there that Lex's parents, after Lex turned to crime, left Smallville and changed their name from Luthor to Thorell, an anagram of Luthor, and told young Lena that her brother had died in a mountain climbing accident. And then, unfortunately, Jules and Arlene themselves die in a car accident, leaving Lena an orphan. So that's really Lex's parents' claim to fame in the pre-crisis landscape, is that they shun their villainous son, they leave, they change their name, and they die.
Mm-hmm.
Had you even encountered them? Because I really went through as best as I could, and it really, you see that initial flashback to what happened in Superman's Girlfriend number 23, and then you'll see that same flashback play out in a handful of other pre-crisis stories, but that's really the extent of it.
I remember reading about Thurl, but the parents I had not from the pre-crisis. So, and thinking about this, like, this is the time where Lex is just villainous. He's not, CEO. He's not rich. He is just a evil, villainous scientist.
Yeah, mad scientist era of the character. I guess I have two thoughts / questions. One is, and I never thought about this until now, when we get to Smallville, we'll find out that Lex had a brother who died as an infant named Julian. Do we think that those Smallville writers were aware that Lex's pre-crisis father was named Jules? Or is it just a coincidence?
I'm going to say they dug in and found it, because why else would you use the name Julian?
Yeah, fair. And not an L name.
I'm going to give them a bit of a doubt, because I feel like there was some pulls. It's one of those deep pulls that you don't even realize until you're watching it later, like now. And we're talking about, like, wait, did they do this? And I'm going to give them the benefit of a doubt and say they did.
And then here's my other question, and maybe this is all that's left to be said about Jules and Arlene. Like I was saying a moment ago, by the time we get to the post-crisis landscape, it becomes clear the effect that Lex's parents have on him. And we see various forms of abuse that Lex and Lena endure at their hands. This here in the pre-crisis landscape, though, is an exception. I mean, these are parents who are essentially innocuous. They're non-entities. I mean, you can argue, oh, they shunned their son and they turned their back on him and they left, but he was already down this villainous road anyway. So I would argue this version of his parents really had no hand in shaping the villain that he turned out to be. And I guess my question is there any value in that to you from a story perspective, or is it simply not as rich as what we will get moving forward?
It's not as rich. I mean, looking back at a lot of those, I mean, think parents weren't a big deal. I mean, they killed the Kents. Like pre-crisis Kents were what, maybe a couple of panels because they didn't really focus on them, you know, especially the Golden Age. I'm thinking of the Golden Age specifically, but
yeah, I mean, obviously you would see the Kents and the Superboy stories, but even then it would take quite some time before you really got into more of the lessons and the imparting of the wisdom that we now associate with them, right? They didn't have a ton of that to do, even when we were seeing them in those stories. I mean, I guess in a version like this, it's really pinning all of Lex's villainy on his balding at the hands of Superboy, as he believes, and of course accusing Superboy of jealousy. So it just simplifies and reduces it to its sort of bare bones component there. And I think for the time and for the audience, I get it. I much prefer what we would get moving forward. But yeah, we start here with Jules and Arlene.
It's building those more three-dimensional rounded characters with more layers of what we experience, where it's not just evil for evil's sake. There's a reason behind things.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So now we move into the post-crisis era of comic books here and other media as well. And we have this stretch here, I would say, from the start of the post-crisis era up until the beginning of the Smallville television series. And I know I'm crossing media here, but bear with me. And so in this immediate post-crisis period, Lex's parents are unnamed, and they live in Suicide Slum, poor, and physically and verbally abusive. A lot of arguing at each other and taking it out on Lex as well. And we see this in the unauthorized biography of Lex with the Donald Trump-esque cover. We see this on the Superboy TV series, where we have Superboy entering the mind of Lex and experiencing his memories, and it's a fascinating two-parter. And in Superman number 131, written by Dan Jurgens, and that's where we get the birth of Lena Luthor, the daughter, more to say on her. But in that issue, we get flashbacks there to Lex's upbringing, his friendship with Perry White in Suicide Slum, and all of that. And honestly, actually, this is breaking with the timeline here a little bit, but I think we also have to add Superman and Lois to this category of poor, unnamed, abusive parents. Because when we do get that flashback in season 4 of Superman and Lois, it's very much in this mold.
Yes, it is.
And obviously with this version, and specifically in the comic book arena, the story here is that Lex, as a boy, sabotaged their car, causing this deathly car accident, and he inherited the insurance money. I mean, I guess this feels like somewhat of a bridge to me, because we're not getting the level of development, right, that we would see in subsequent iterations with his parents. But now this is clearly a pivot from what came before. And now they're very much the sense that, okay, Lex's upbringing had this very clear impact on him. Big surprise, right? Obviously, I gravitate more towards the Smallville version with Lionel, where it's more of this mental and emotional manipulation and this much colder approach to parenting, in stark contrast to what Clark is experiencing with the Kents and what Lex is observing. And I feel like there's just a lot more to mine there. But I guess what I will say, in the realm of the unnamed, abusive, Suicide Slum parents post-crisis, the Lex-centric issue of For All Seasons by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, when Lex is talking about his upbringing, there's this whole bit about how his father would hit him, would beat him, and Lex would never cry or beg. He would never give him that satisfaction. And it taught Lex the lesson to always give people what they want, but always at a price. And I thought that whole explanation that Lex goes through really kind of brought that version of the character into sharp focus for me. So I feel like that was a story that I think really maximized the impact of a version of his parents like this.
That makes complete sense. Because then it shows, that goes back to like the things that he does in that story too.
Right. Okay, shall we move to the Lionel and Lillian / Leticia version of his parents?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So yeah, parents are a big category here because they come in a number of different forms. And of course, by the time Smallville begins in 2001, now we have the Lionel Luthor iteration of Lex's father, this business mogul who employs a harsh brand of parenting, ostensibly to prepare his son for the challenges of the world that await him. Now, we've talked a lot about Lionel, and we could do a whole episode on Lionel, and I don't want to get too bogged down here. But of course, I want to give the character his due. And let me toss you the ball first, I guess, just your overall thoughts on Lionel and the impact that his brand of parenting had on the way Lex turned out.
So real quick, and to bridge the gap on Lionel, I checked real quick because I wasn't 100% sure, but on the episodes of Titans named Connor, when Connor goes back to Smallville, we do meet Lex's poor, abusive father, and they do call him Lionel. So I couldn't remember, but I like I said, I double checked because I wanted to make sure, and because it very much was that what you were just saying, the more of the post-crisis, abusive, dirt poor, but they called him Lionel. Now Lionel's in Smallville, I think, is beautiful because they really positioned to show the parenting of the Kents versus that of, the Luthors, but also because at this time, Lex had become more of the contemporary for Clark, pulling from those Superboy stories compared to being the contemporary, like you said, for Perry White and an Olderman. So Lionel inherited a lot of the history of Lex. Lionel, had his parents killed. And I think has a very interesting just parenting of being if I'm hard on my son, he'll be a better man, but never actually loves his son.
Yeah. Well, on the note of the version of Lionel we get in Titans, yeah, we do have multiple versions of Lionel, and we'll circle back to that because more to say on that front. But yeah, I mean, as far as this version of Lionel that we get in the show, I mean, this was a first. I think the one exception that I guess for the sake of completeness we should mention is that in the first season of the Superboy television series, the Scott Wells version of Lex, who he'll later be recast for the remaining seasons, but there's the Fixer episode where Lex is fixing the college basketball game. And Clark asks him, like, how'd you end up like this, Lex? And part of Lex's response is, I have a very rich father. Now, that's obviously not the case by the time we get to season 4, Know Thine Enemy, which we just referenced, and we see these poor abusive parents. I think we can employ a little bit of headcanon, retroactive continuity and say that Lex was lying. He was covering in that first season episode. There's nothing in the show itself to account for that, and I don't think they intended that, but I think that's maybe how we can reconcile it. But hey, credit where credit's due. This idea of Lex coming from great wealth was at least a line in one episode of the Superboy show a good decade plus before Smallville. But obviously Smallville took it to a whole nother level and really developed it.
They didn't know what they were going to do with season 2. So, for as far as, like you said, when they said it, that's probably what they believed. He was the preppy. He was a representation of the 80s. Yuppie.
Yeah. But the Lionel of Smallville, you're right. He is bestowed with a number of the traits that we typically associate with Lex. Certainly his position in the business world, the fact that he had his parents killed in this tenement fire, which we find out. But throughout the show, I mean, and especially in those early seasons, we see that he's clearly trained Lex in terms of history and military strategy, but he's also always lying and manipulating and spying on him, and will take even worse steps when Lex finds out what Lionel has done with respect to killing Lionel's parents. So there's a lot on that front, and we've talked about it in past episodes, but it's one of those things, like we're getting at, the show really highlighted that stark contrast in parenting styles, and I really think that helped account for why Clark and Lex each turned out the way that they did. One episode, I mean, I feel like if someone was going to watch one episode for the Lionel of it all, it would be the season 3 episode Memoria, because we get some crucial flashbacks there. And there's one scene at Lex's birthday party where no one shows up, and Lionel actually comforts his son and gives him a gift that's a box forged from the armor of St. George. And he has this whole story he tells Lex about how St. George put all his fears and his doubts in there. And it's perhaps the one instance that we see on the show of him actually being a semi-decent parent. But what we also find out in that episode is that Lex had thought he was responsible for the death of his baby brother, Julian, but in fact, he had repressed the memory that he had walked in on his mother, Lillian, who was clearly suffering from postpartum depression, smothering the baby in the crib.
Mm-hmm.
And Lex, as a young boy, took the fall, took the blame when Lionel walked in, and he repressed all of this. But the result is that they have this, and it's one of the most amazing scenes between these two incredible actors, but in this moment where this all comes out, and Lionel's like, if I had known. And Lex is like, what, you might have actually loved me? And it's this incredible moment between the two of them. And Lex explains he took the fall because he knew his mother would be the lamb to the slaughter, but as Lionel's sole remaining heir, Lionel would protect his son. So it was just a fascinating episode to actually see a glimpse of him being a good parent, but then to see what led to this absence of love. Amazing episode.
It's one that I wish we could have built on a little bit more. If because that, like you said, like that's the one we see before. Maybe Lionel would have been a good parent. Maybe he would have been, but that turned him a little colder. So instead of giving his son love, he gave his son the stark reality, militaristic upbringing as a resentment for him.
And then I think the other sort of key aspect to this character, looking at his life across the series, is that he does arguably turn over a new leaf and become an ally to Clark in those later seasons. And of course, this further drives the wedge between Lex and Clark. As Lex says at one point, like, I've been starving for any affection from my father my whole life. And then when he's finally prepared to give it, it's to you. There's that. My view has always been that Lionel did indeed find some measure of redemption, particularly in terms of his motives. I think his tactics didn't totally change. And so
it couldn't change who he is completely. He can't change what he knows and knows how to do it. But his reasons for it and why he's doing it is what changed.
Exactly. And so that's kind of the way I look at that character. So even when he's doing some questionable things in those later seasons, like late season 5, 6, 7, it's still, I think the motives are good in a way that they weren't before, even if this is still how he knows how to operate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the Lionel on Smallville. Absolute standout, of course, is played by John Glover. I want to get to the comics, but Lionel does also appear in one episode of Supergirl in season 2 in a flashback. And this is when he brings young Lena to the house to now be part of the family. And initially it was thought that she was simply adopted. Of course, we will find out that she's biologically a Luthor. She is the son of Lionel and this woman he had an affair with. The Lionel in this flashback on Supergirl bald. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, that ain't Lionel. That's one of the things. You look at Smallville and he has this luxurious flowing mane that at certain points in the show just get longer and longer. And it's like, oh man, he's purposely trying to spite his bald son.
Yes.
So that did not really look or feel like Lionel, but we did get another live action version. And I know you mentioned Titans as well, although even the model for that was different, but
yes.
we have had Lionel on screen in a few instances.
But what's interesting is Lionel, with a very little bit we got him on Supergirl, seemed very small and passive. And I think later on in season 4, I think he's mentioned a couple more times, but the show focused on Lillian.
Yes. Yeah, I think that show, yeah, exactly. Built up Lillian at the expense of Lionel, built up Supergirl at the expense of Superman, but that's a separate thing. But yeah, I think that it showed where the focus was and the characters that they were looking to develop there. So circling back to these different versions of Lionel, we have, of course, John Glover as the character on screen on Smallville starting in 2001. Not too long after, in the comics, we have my favorite telling of the Superman origin story, Birthright, written by Mark Waid. And there, to be honest, I don't remember off the top of my head if he's even explicitly named as Lionel, but he certainly looks like Lionel in the one panel that we see him in. And he and Lex are living in this mansion at the top of a hill that overlooks Smallville. And in the fire that results from Lex's experiments with the kryptonite, Lionel is killed. So we don't really get much there, but certainly visually, when he opens the door in that one scene when Clark comes to call on Lex, I mean, it definitely looks like the Lionel from the Smallville television show. But here's the other thing that's really kind of interesting to me, which is the whole idea of, in the comics, Lionel being wealthy. We really only see that in Birthright.
Mm-hmm.
Because by the time, moving forward now, a few years down the line, we get to Secret Origin by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank, we're back to the poor, abusive, drunk version who's raising Lex and the sister. And in Secret Origin, we have multiple attempts. I think we only actually see one, but I think the idea is like Lex has been trying to kill his father, but the secret Superboy, who's not publicly known, but he's operating in the background, has been saving him. But then it is ultimately a heart attack that does Lionel in. I assume the implication is that Lex had a hand in that. I mean, I think that's the idea. That's how I read it.
Way. That's how I read it.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like that's something, that Lex, because he uses the insurance money to kickstart his company.
Yes.
That's kind of been a foundation. In Smallville, it was Lionel, but it's like in Lex, because, he moved away. He disappeared. The next day it was like it never existed.
Exactly. But I mean, so I would say overall, with the exception of the television side of things, really in the modern era, this whole idea of a poor, abusive father, at least a father, if not both parents, has been relatively consistent. Worth noting here, Scott Snyder's Justice League series, number 17. I don't know if you read it, but this is going back a few years now, but there's this whole hidden backstory between Lex and Martian Manhunter. And we find out, I'll keep this real quick. But we find out that Lionel had been a scientist and was part of this group that transported a very young J'onn J'onzz to Earth. And ultimately, everything went awry and fell apart. And Lionel's memory of these events, his memory was erased, and he became kind of a broken man and turned into the poor, abusive drunkard that we had known. So I think this was Scott Snyder's attempt to pull a Jeff Johns and merge, for example, the Birthright and Secret Origin versions of Lionel.
It's like, hey, you want to make another reason why Lex hates the Justice League? They basically made his father into an abuser.
Yeah, I'm mixed on this. As the audience knows, I was not the biggest Scott Snyder fan. Didn't love that run of Justice League, which tied into the metal events. This felt like, I don't know, a hat on a hat to me, but I guess I appreciate the attempt to sort of meld these disparate versions of Lionel that we had. And so if you want a version of Lionel who's kind of everything, who had been, although even the scientist angle is distinct, but if you want a Lionel who had kind of been on one track and then became the Lionel that we see, for example, in Secret Origin, you do get that with the Snyder story. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. My comic shop closed over a decade ago, but if there's one place where I feel that same sense of camaraderie, it's Fat Moose Comics, New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store, led by current owner Sean Hendricks. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany, New Jersey, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. I'm a parent, which means that a family-friendly comic shop is a must, and there's none better than Aw Yeah Comics. Visit one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. Follow them on social media and at awyeahcomics.com for news about signings, live sales, and much more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. We love digging into epic comic book runs, but what about the art of the single issue? Single Bound is a podcast series hosted by married couple Amy and Logan as they review single issues of comics, many of them starring the Man of Steel, Logan's favorite character. Listen and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and follow the show on Instagram at Single Bound Podcast. So That's sort of the Lionel side of things. Shall we move to Lex's mother in the
let's do it.
in the modern year? So either Lillian or Leticia, depending on the version that we're talking about here.
And that gets me why. Like, I know in the current comics they put it as Leticia. Why? Why make it more complicated? Lillian's already a perfectly good, suitable name.
Yeah. So
why?
I know, man. So she's Lillian on Smallville, like we referenced, and generally in terms of the little bit we see, but more so what's said about her, seems like she was very caring and loving in contrast to Lionel, but of course was suffering from this postpartum depression and did take the horrific step of murdering their infant son to protect Julian from being subjected to Lionel's brand of parenting. So a very tragic outcome. And then
which then right there makes you question, because what we were just hypothesizing was Lionel being a good parent until Julian's death.
Well, so my read on that, going back to the Lionel bit, it's hard to say, like, we're not really shown enough, although we did see in the very opening of the pilot, when Lex is balded after the meteor shower, the look of disgust that Lionel has on his face. So I don't think he was world's greatest dad before the Memoria events, but I just think maybe there was a greater capacity that he had, and maybe he could have tapped into that side more moving forward, if not for the fact that he came to think Lex murdered Julian. So yeah, it's not like, I don't think he was the best dad before, but I just think he had a little bit more potential.
He wasn't us. We know that.
But so we have Lillian, then she passes away from a terminal disease when Lex is young, and Lex will see her in various visions, like in Lexmas, for example, and Fracture as well, I believe. So we have saintly Lillian on Smallville, and then we have a very different take on Lillian on the Supergirl TV show, where she's very much an antagonist. Very much to both her children.
I mean, I think the world's worst couple ever would be if you put Smallville's Lionel with Supergirl's Lillian.
Yeah. And I mean, at least at the outset, she's running the Cadmus Project, this anti-alien group. So yeah, just very different takes. And I guess it served its function in that particular show, especially where we're developing the character of Lena, who's struggling against the Luthor name and legacy. So to now put this mother figure in opposition, I think they were able to mine that well. But yeah, just two very different takes on Lily.
Yeah, they always want to do like the daughter versus the mother, the son versus the father.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, as far as the comic books go, I mean, once we get past the immediate post-crisis period where we see both of those parents and they're abusive and they're arguing and all of that, I guess by the time we get to Birthright, Secret Origin, it's like when we see young Lex's home life, it's the father, and typically it seems like the mother has died, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was always my read on it, because I feel like it wasn't like she just left. I always felt like she died. It was just because.
Yeah. But then, okay, so I was really trying to dig into this. So as far as I can tell, the first time that Lex's mother was referred to as, I've been saying Leticia, but Leticia was in Countdown to Final Crisis number 34. I've never read that entire event, but they did these like 2-page backup origin stories, and they had one for Lex. And in Countdown 34, and that backup story, his parents are named as business mogul Lionel and socialite Leticia.
Wow. You would think that, being DC in the more modern era, they'd have a giant, canonical Bible, so to speak, that says, hey, these are the names of Lex's parents.
Yeah. But so I don't know, in fairness, it's like that was established because much more recently, when Lex's mother, Leticia, popped up in the pages of the Josh Williamson Superman book, I was like, who is this?
Yeah, so was I. But I mean, credit where credit's due. When was that Countdown? What year was that was printed?
Oh man, I want to say 2008-ish.
Okay, so fair enough. So that would be Smallville would already be in going. So yeah, it's not like they ignored it or anything.
Okay, it gets more complicated. You ready for it?
Oh, please.
This is the fun part, the really fun part of this, which is, so in that same story, that little origin recap, it explains that after Lex left Smallville, Lena was entrusted to the care of Aunt Lillian. And this was further expanded upon in the pages of Superwoman in the Rebirth era, where we get a bit of a recounting of Lena the sister's backstory. And there is, we see in flashback, she's been taken in by Aunt if you're fancy, Aunt Lillian. And Lillian encouraged her pursuit of science, and Lena went to school and all of this. So it seems like, and I'm not aware of anything that would have upended this from a continuity sense. So it seems like comic book wise, currently, Mother is Leticia, and there's this Aunt Lillian floating out there who had cared for the sister Lena and encouraged her pursuit of her studies in science.
Which she could look at as a mother.
Right.
Fixed it.
All right. So recapping quickly what we've done so far in terms of parents, we have Jules and Arlene pre-crisis, immediately post-crisis, these unnamed parents. And then more recently, we have Lionel and either Lillian or Leticia, depending on which version we're talking about. And we also have a version of an Aunt Lillian. Now I want to circle back to some ancestors that I dug up here. So these primarily come from Who Killed Jimmy Olsen, the standout maxi series by Fraction and Lieber, and the Superman Y2K special written by Joe Kelly, friend of the podcast. So from Who Killed Jimmy Olsen, we have this backstory, and I'll keep this quick, and we've talked about this before, between Lex Luthor and Joachim Olsen, who were battling for land in Oberstadt, which would ultimately become Metropolis. So there's this back and forth as they're jockeying for land rights.
I like those names.
Yeah, absolutely. Then moving forward a bit, we and Lex find out that there was a secret affair between Hannah Alexandria Luthor and Jimberly Jimington Olsen. Now, their exact relation is purposely vague. The caption actually says great something or other. So we're never given an exact designation for their familial relation, but there was this secret affair between an ancestor of Lex and an ancestor of Jimmy that resulted in a child, which means Lex and Jimmy are distant cousins. And by extension, then Lex is also distant cousins with Janie Olsen and Julian Olsen as well. There's another Julian for you.
Thank you.
I feel like this aspect, this is something I would love to see be referenced, become part of the book. Because the whole idea of, and I know maybe this goes against what I was saying about not wanting to have too many relatives floating around, but just the idea of Lex having to deal with Olsen on a familial level, amazing. I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
It could be fun with the right writers. But once again, at the same time, it's that whole feeling that they're shrinking the world instead of expanding the world. But I mean, that's comics, right? They ups and downs.
Yeah. Again, I love that Who Killed Jimmy Olsen story so much that I'll take it if there's an avenue to do something more.
I read that and I liked it, but I forgot about that.
It's so good. I mean, we did a whole episode and I'm already like, maybe I do another episode because it was so good. Okay. Then from that Y2K special, we get these flashbacks throughout the story to various ancestors of Lex's. And so there's Dame Edna Luthor, his great-grandmother, who in 1847 is speaking out against anti-Irish sentiment, right? And this is a bit of a theme in these flashbacks that we get, that these Luthor ancestors they welcomed everybody. And then we see this turn into this anti-immigrant / anti-alien sentiment that Lex would embrace. But we start with Dame Edna Luthor in 1847 speaking up in defense of Irish immigrants. Then we flash ahead to 1916 and grandfather Wallace Luthor, who has a steel factory or something to that effect, and he is enlisted to build ships for World War I. And then we catch up with Wallace again in about 1969, 1970, and he's an old, broken man. Essentially, he lost everything in the stock market crash, and he thinks it's punishment for his role in contributing to the war effort. And at this point, we have Lex's father knocking him around and spouting this anti-immigrant sentiment to a young Lex in Suicide Slum. So that's the Y2K special. Kind of filled in a few branches here.
And that's really good of just like how an event can happen that reshapes a family dynasty. Like when they're on this high, and that's almost like they were coming from wealth, because they would have made so much money during the war. And then you have probably into World War II right after it. And then, yeah, that's a really good way of kind of bringing they came from, like, they have that anger. We had something and we lost it all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, credit to Joe Kelly, because I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of flesh that out there. And against the backdrop of the Y2K storyline and the introduction of Brainiac 13, but there was some real meat on the bone there. And then you had reminded me, I can't believe I forgot because it's from Smallville, but
yes, I felt so good when I said that. You're like, oh yeah, I was like, I got something.
Yeah, but Lachlan and Eliza Luthor, the parents of Lionel, who he had killed in this tenement fire, but we actually see Lachlan in the season 3 episode Relic. That's where we get these flashes of Jor-El, aka Joe, on his walkabout on Earth, romancing Lana Lang's great aunt Louisa. And Lachlan ends up being the murderer of Louisa,
which I thought was it's neat. Like, that's kind of neat storytelling, and that kind of shows how where the Luthor family was to where Lionel then has to get themselves out of it.
Yeah, and I think it's in that episode where we find out, because like Lionel had told Lex they come from Scottish nobility.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, they're from Scottish nobility, and that's why the Luthor mansion was brought over brick by brick from Scotland, and that's what I'm saying. He fabricated his entire existence.
All right, so recapping the ancestors here again, we have Luthais Luthor, we have the secret affair between Hannah Alexandria and Jimberly Jimington, Dame Edna Luthor, the great grandmother, Wallace Luthor, the grandfather, and then from Smallville, Lachlan and Eliza, Lex's grandparents. Okay, now we hit a big category here of sisters, and I say sisters. Obviously, the heavy hitter is Lena, and she comes in a number of different forms, but we would be remiss if we did not also mention this older, unnamed sister who, according to an editor's note in the Bronze Age, moved to Europe and gave birth to Nasthalthia, aka Nasty Luthor, who becomes a nemesis for Supergirl in Adventure Comics during the Bronze Age. And what's particularly wild about this is the whole business about who Nasty's parents are. It's never addressed in story. They didn't account for it. So it was in an editor's note or in the letters page or something like that, where they explained, oh, Lex also had this older sister who moved away to Europe and had this daughter. So there's an older unnamed sister floating out there, mother to Nasty. But obviously the big one is Lena. Yes.
Yes. Especially because one of my big comics pet peeves is when someone has a child and they're like, oh, I'm going to name them after my father, or, oh, I'm going to name them after my dead sister. And then you have like John Kent, Jonathan Kent. The whole Lena as his daughter sister thing gets crazy. I like the sister aspect, and I just wish we gave the daughter a different name, but whatever.
I mean, it's one of those things, and obviously we'll get to Lena the daughter, but it's like by the time Lex had a child, the sister Lena was long gone from continuity. So I'm sure the feeling was, oh, this is a way we can reuse the name and have a version of this character. Fine. But we see the tides change, and then eventually the sister is back in play. And then, yes, this gets very confusing. So we have a number of different permutations of Lena. And it's interesting because I do feel like what they accomplish, there is a distinction between the comic book side of things and the multimedia adaptations, particularly Smallville and Supergirl. But we'll start with the pre-crisis comics, Lena Thurl. We had laid out the basic backstory before, but she becomes a supporting character in Supergirl's stories, much to my surprise, because I didn't realize this before I began my Supergirl homework, but she had, in the pre-crisis era, ESP, which she derived after touching, no joke, a space brain that Big Brother Lex had in his lab. So which is funny, we'll get to the Supergirl TV show, but by the end of that show, she's a witch. She's got magical powers, but the idea of Lena Luthor having powers does have its origins in her earliest appearances in the comics. The big thing about Lena Thurl was that she didn't know Lex was her brother. And everyone, particularly Lex, and even including Supergirl, worked to keep it that way, to protect her. And to your point, and going back to what I was saying about like what these characters can represent, that's a perfect instance of Lena's existence and this quest to keep her from knowing that her brother is this monster. It does show some shred of warmth, of love, of humanity on Lex's part. And I think really represents like a big exception for him, right? The fact that he goes to these lengths to try to protect her.
Mm-hmm. It also, like, I'm a big look at the nature versus nurture. Is the Luthor side innate, or is it just something that happened with Lex?
Well, I mean, honestly, in most of the comic book versions of Lena, with one exception in the New 52/Rebirth era, but I think most iterations of her in the comics and the versions that we get on television, especially Smallville and Supergirl, I think, yeah, you do see that she's able to escape the darkness that's present in the Luthor family. So no, yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that shows, like with anything, right? There's a combination of nature and nurture. And I think you see that that generally the character of Lena is able to transcend, right? Whereas Lex was not. But drilling down a little bit more on the pre-crisis Lena here. So she does get married to an FBI agent named Jeff Colby, more on him because he's the brother-in-law, and gives birth to a son named Val, more on him in the nieces and nephews category. And then bringing us kind of to the end of her pre-crisis journey, there was a little arc in Superman Family 212 to 214 where she lost her ESP powers after surgery, and she had to be shaved for the surgery, and she looked at her bald head in the mirror and finally recognized and remembered that Lex is her brother. Because there were numerous instances where she learned that she was Lex's brother, but then through various machinations, she lost her memory. And so the last part of this little arc is her starting to have a conversation with Lex, and Supergirl flies away, and she's like, oh, it seems like they might be able to patch things up. And then she's never seen again before Crisis. So it was an intriguing note to end on that just didn't go anywhere.
They didn't patch things up. She ended up a speed bump on 5th.
Oh,
that just seems like that's the kind of Lex we're dealing with.
Yeah. And then immediately post-Crisis on the Superboy TV show, like you said, we do have this version of Lena who Lex does truly love and tries to protect in this abusive household. So yeah, that was very effective.
That was the stories. He took the abuse to protect her.
Yeah. And then that carries through when we get to this post-Infinite Crisis territory with the Superman Secret Origin, where, yeah, he's protecting Lena in this abusive household. And she kind of represents this lone bright spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the past. In the present, takes a very tragic turn, because when we get to that Boy of Steel arc from Adventure Comics by Jeff Johns and Francis Manapul, we find out that Lena is still in Smallville with her daughter, Lori, and she's ill and has been confined to a wheelchair. And Lex shows up, and Superboy challenges Lex, like, hey, you always say you can do all of these things if not for Superman. Well, Superman's not on Earth right now. He's on New Krypton. Why don't you help your sister? And as you might recall, he actually does. He creates a cure for her, and she stands up, and they embrace, and then he takes it away. He injects her with something that reverts her to her prior state. And it's absolutely heart-wrenching.
Mm-hmm. It shows that he can do it, but he just chooses not to.
As he says, miracles don't exist. Lex Luthor does. I hit a little bit of a wall with this because, like I said, this is kind of a thread. And whenever we talk about Lex, I always hope for more from him. And I always hope for the best in terms of what he's capable of. But I do feel like Lena at least represents like some exception for him. So the idea that he would be that cold even to her, I don't know. It's a little bit of a tough pill to swallow, but at the same time, I guess I can accept it. And in the context of that story, that was really important, because that was Connor recognizing, because he was wrestling with, am I more like Superman or am I more like Lex? 50% of his DNA comes from each of these guys. And what Lex did was so over the top, so cold, that Connor realized, though, I'm not like that. So it served that function. But yeah, I mean, that was brutal.
But it also, I mean, it's not 100% surprising, because if you were to think if Lena did represent that bright spot, he wouldn't have let her get that bad. That's the story almost right there. I'm like, okay, give me their background story. Like, what was their relationship like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the next time we kind of get into it. So that's post Infinite Crisis, but then we get into the New 52 and Rebirth territory, and this was really a blind spot. This was really where I had to dig in a little bit, because there's a bit of a blind spot there for me. But there we meet an adult Lena who is wheelchair bound and working in the basement of one of Lex's labs. And what we find out is that she had been ill when she was younger, and Lex's failed attempt to help her confined her to the wheelchair, left her paralyzed. Now there is this stretch where he talks about how like, oh, I didn't try to help her because I didn't think I'd be able to, or something like that. But no, it turns out he actually did, and he wasn't able to, and it left her confined to this. But she had a role at LexCorp and was developing projects and initiatives and whatnot, but not getting the credit for it. So he really kind of kept her locked away. Then there was this business where she had contact with a mother box, and then she was comatose. But then in that Superwoman series featuring Lana Lang in that superhero,
I read that and I don't even remember this. That's what's crazy is I read it.
Well, there we find out that Lex tried to help her again, this time by using the solar flare energy discharge given off when the New 52 Superman died. And this too backfired, but it gave her powers and it turned her into Ultra Woman. And she created these Bizarro clones, and she was responsible for the death of the New 52 Lois Lane, who had become Superwoman. As I am rattling all of this off, I'm like, this sounds insane. But yes, that's what we have.
And like, I've read all of that because I went back to and I don't remember all of it.
Yeah. I mean, that version, and look, in fairness, I didn't read all of those stories in full. So I don't want to give I don't want to pass judgment necessarily, but that more villainous turn for her, I don't quite love. I think for me, the sweet spot with Lena is, yes, either representing this tether to his humanity and creating some opportunity for some loving act on the part of Lex, or bringing us to our last two major categories here with Lena, Smallville and Supergirl, showing how she can transcend the Luthor dynasty and the darkness in this family to become something good and to become an ally. And so what we get in New 52 and Rebirth doesn't really fall into either of those categories. It's fine to me, but not my preferred take. So we get Lena on Smallville, and we don't know it. And I don't think the show knew it until very late in the game here. Because we have the introduction of Tess Mercer at the beginning of season 8 after Michael Rosenbaum's Lex has departed the show. And we talked about Tess when we did our henchman discussion on your show. Yep. And yeah, she was essentially an amalgam of Miss Tessmacher and Mercy Graves. And she had been a disciple of Lex, more or less, and had taken over his company. But by the time we get to season 10, we get this revelation that she's actually the illegitimate child of Lionel Luthor and Pamela Jenkins, who had been Lex's nanny. And Lionel brought her when she was a young girl to the Granny Goodness orphanage. And she recalls this and sees her birth certificate and learns that she's actually Luthor Lena Luthor.
I was just like, okay, all right. I mean, at this point, I was just like, okay, like we keep popping up with different siblings. It was kind of neat because we had the history with, Lena in the comics, but also it gave her a little bit more dynamic of almost like Tess kind of represented Clark getting it right, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because he is able to turn Tess to the bright side, so to speak. I'm still always bummed that she dies. And in the season finale of Smallville, no one cares. Or even, where's Tess? What happened to Tess? Nothing. She just goes off and dies and everyone's okay.
I know that was tough. I mean, I guess at the time I was probably intrigued by that revelation. I think looking at the larger picture, it's like, no, I don't think they had this idea until season 10. But I mean, I don't know. On the one hand, I think you can kind of cynically look at it and say, oh, they just never knew what to do with this character. And there were all these different aspects to her backstory, including her being a Luthor. But on the other hand, it's like, well, I don't know. I feel like this was a way to kind of bring it home and put a button on it. And in that last season, you had the Lionel from an alternate Earth. And then, of course, by the series finale, we would get Lex back and we had the Lex clones running around. So a bit of a Luthor theme in the final season. So tying her into that was good. But I think ultimately the value there is exactly what you hit on. The fact that Clark was able to get through to her and forge a new path in a way that he wasn't with Lex. And I think it's in that episode or right around that episode where she finds out where he has this line about Luthor blood being poison. Mm-hmm. And that's why she doesn't want to tell him about what she's learned, but ultimately does. And he is there for her. And there's this great scene between them up in the loft in the mansion. And yeah, I mean, he really takes her in. She becomes part of the fold and a member of the team. And when you get to that final scene of hers in the series finale with Lex, where he stabs her and he says, "I'm doing this to save you from becoming me." And she's like, "It's too late. Clark already did that." Beautiful moment. I agree. It would have been nice if her passing had been acknowledged by anyone, but I'm glad that, and in her death, she hits Lex with that neurotoxin that erases all of his memories, which I abhor on so many levels. Yes. From the perspective of Lex as a character. But the idea that she goes out helping Clark, even though I don't like the way she does it, but the fact that she did that in her final moments, I did like.
It makes more sense while secretly Lex had her promoted, had a watchful eye on her, you know, and with what we know about this Lex and about how he pulled from his history, that he probably would have discovered who she really was. And that's why he had her part of Lex Corp and Luthor Corp and everything, why she moved through the ranks so well. And while upon his death, all of a sudden she's in charge.
Yeah, it's like retroactive, like it all actually does make sense, right? Even if not originally intended, but it does track. So yeah, I mean, she was great. And Cassidy Freeman did a great job. And especially since there were so many moving parts with that character, and I really don't think they knew what she was going to be from the outset. And so she really had to play this sort of nebulous character in terms of what her deal is and what she knows and what her agenda is. And I thought she did a great job with that. So, and she had massive shoes to fill in replacing Michael Rosenbaum, essentially. And I really like what the character of Tess brought to the show.
I did too. And I think in the end, the way it worked out works better for the show as a whole, because like you just said, it retroactively makes it all better.
But then I think arguably the most notable Lena is Katie McGrath's character on the Supergirl TV show, who we meet at the beginning of season 2. Yeah.
Yeah. But here's something I thought about with this. Looking at the way they did Lillian on that show as more of the vile, poisonous, probably person, where maybe Lionel was more, for sake of conversation, maybe he was a little bit more kinder. That's why Lionel died first. It kind of shows that maybe the Luthor evil came from Lillian. Because a half sister.
Right.
So maybe, that whole, like, the evil because of who Lex is and Lillian is, and why Lena fights back as much, is the evil came from that side of the family.
Oh, interesting.
Just a thought.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, she became a big part of the show. I mean, I have to imagine at least part of the reason for introducing her, we lost Callista Flockhart as Cat Grant. So we lost that powerful corporate female presence, and Lena filled that, certainly. And really ties in what we're talking about a Luthor looking to change the name and like what the name means and the legacy. And you see her forge this friendship with Kara and the rest of the Super Friends throughout the show, although plenty of bumps along the road when she's experimenting with the Harnell and stockpiling kryptonite. And I mean, I think most notably when she finally learns that Kara Danvers is Supergirl and she hadn't told her. And that really leads to a fracture in their relationship, and even leads to her temporarily working with Lex for that project Non Nocere that's going to cure all the evils of the world, right?
And right there shows her she's doing these crazy things with the idea that she's actually helping cure people and helping, right? Compared to Lex, who knows he's just doing horrible things.
I did rewatch earlier today the 100th episode of the show. It's a Super Life.
I was going to bring that up. And we got that great episode with the Thomas Lennon Mixospitalik.
Yeah. Where he takes Kara on this tour through her friendship with Lena and affords her the opportunity to essentially have a redo and reveal her secret to Lena at all these various points. And you see how it plays out. And ultimately there are these disastrous consequences, no matter when Kara tells her secret identity, or even in the last version where she never even forges any friendship with Lena. That's the worst case scenario. And we end up in this post-apocalyptic national city. So I thought that really worked. And obviously we will get to the point where they will repair things. But yeah, I mean, it's, by the way, that episode or that kind of episode, do I wish Smallville had done that. I so wish they had done, just to let Clark and the audience see how it actually would have played out if he had confided in Lex. You know, that was one thing we got, not Lex centric, but we got kind of a version of this with the 200th episode, Homecoming, where Brainiac 5 takes Clark on this tour through his past, present, and future, but it's not Lex centric. Like, I wish we could have gotten an episode, the Clark and Lex version of Kara and Lena.
It would have been very eye-opening of what that might have looked like, just because Clark does go, what if I had told Lex? What if I just been up front from the very beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then as I've said now numerous times, I stopped watching early on in season 6, so I didn't see this live, but yes, I understand that Lena did ultimately was revealed she was a witch and she had magical powers.
Yep. Yeah, bro. That last season's rough.
I mean, maybe the elephant in the room when it comes to Kara and Lena on that show, I know there was a vocal fan contingent that wanted to see the two of them as a romantic pairing, right? The Supercorp pairing. But I mean, I would say overall, I really liked Katie McGrath in the role.
Oh, her Lena was great.
She was great. The one thing though, so I don't know if you watch Sons of Anarchy, Charlie Hunnam, amazing actor, but I feel like Charlie Hunnam and Katie McGrath, they went to the same school of accents, but she was great. I love the presence. I love the dynamic. And yeah, it's like, I love that you got to see a version of a Super and a Luthor who got it right. Whereas Clark and Lex had not. I talk about Smallville a lot, but when it comes to listening, one podcast is at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode. And while their series rewatch has concluded, the podcast continues with more great Smallville and Superman talk. Listen wherever you get podcasts and keep an eye out for the other shows on the Always Hold On To network. Step into the refraction with Drunken Avenger #1, The Volunteer, an indie comic by Rick Reason that turns the tropes upside down. 4 men died in 9 seconds. John Stevens survived, but survival has a price. Now, the government calls him a variable. The media calls him the Drunken Avenger. And the city of Meridian is caught in the crossfire between civil liberty and national security. Follow @Drunken Avenger on social media for project updates and previews. Ever wonder what would happen if a person who knew barely anything about comics decided to absorb hundreds of Superman stories from all eras and media? That's exactly what Robbo is doing on This Podcast Will Never Die, which starts with all the ways the Man of Steel stood out on the newsstands in 1938. Listen and subscribe to This Podcast Will Never Die, and you'll never look at Superman's trunks the same way again. So yeah, on the sisters front, we have this older unnamed sister who fled to Europe and gave birth to Nasty Luthor. And then we have these various versions of Lena. So yeah, I mean, we look at this family tree. Lionel, obviously a heavy hitter. Lena is another one. As we move forward here on the brothers front, not a ton here, but notably on Smallville in the season 2 episode Prodigal, we met the character of Lucas Luthor, played by Paul Wesley, who would go on to star in the Vampire Diaries. And he was Lex's half brother. His mother was Lillian's nurse, Rachel Dunleavy. And Lex tracks Lucas down. And there's all this back and forth where initially they're working against Lionel, but then it seems like Lucas has turned on Lex and is actually aligned with Lionel. But then Lex and Lucas are in cahoots against Lionel. And at the end of it, Lex is gonna protect Lucas, and he's gonna be out there, and he's never seen, and I don't think even mentioned again.
Never referenced again, because you and I had that conversation before, because there was an episode later we talk about like the Luthor Corp buyout to make Lex Corp or whatever, and we like this would be a perfect time to like bring back the brother, because you need the family, and yeah, but it's just it almost felt like an afterthought. They made Lucas and then nothing.
I think because he was on, Paul Wesley was on, or Paul Wasowaleski, as I remember him back in the Everwood days before he changed his name. But when he was on Inside of You, I think he talked about how his memory was that this was supposed to be an actual arc. And that makes sense. Like, you watch this and it really seems to be setting something up. And I don't know why, assuming that was the case, I don't know why they changed their mind, but it becomes this really kind of odd one-off. And this is this whole idea, like, how many relatives should be out there? I definitely am on the side of introducing these relatives very judiciously and with purpose, because otherwise you end up with something like this, which I feel like is a reckless addition to the family tree. I mean, we're going to get to Nasty Luthor in a couple of minutes, but it's like there too. It's like, we're throwing this like niece of Lex out there. And then we don't even have an accounting for how she could exist. And we have to have this editor's note about this older sister. If we're going to have a relative, I just would really want it to really have more of a plan in place.
You pulled the same trick twice, right? You made Lionel had an affair, boom, Lucas. Years later, Lionel had an affair, boom, Leticia.
Yeah.
So it starts to show you, and like I said, if we plotted when those happened after the death of Julian would make a little bit more sense. But then you think that with having another son like Lucas, you think almost that Lionel would have been keeping him, preparing him, that if he ever did need to have Lex step down, that Lucas could be the Luthor heir that he's always wanted. And maybe that would have been the arc to go with, because if, we could have brought him back or whatever when the Julian stuff comes up to light in season 3.
Yeah, the whole idea of Lionel being this philanderer who's fathering all of these kids out there, I mean, I can buy that, but it's just, I wish they had closed the loop on this character, even if we didn't get Paul Wesley back because he was doing Vampire Diaries by that point. But even if, look, we've had other instances of recasting and accounting for it through plastic surgery, or if he was killed off screen or something, I don't know, something, but it would have been nice if they had closed the loop on that. And then, of course, Julian, which we've talked about him already, but then... So we meet Grant Gabriel, played by Michael Cassidy of the OC fame and BVS in that opening scene there. We meet him as the new editor of the Daily Planet in season 7. And then we get this revelation that he's actually a clone of Julian Luthor.
And I remember that happened. I was like, that was one of those things. I was like, what? I was not buying it. I was not for it. That was almost one step too far, because I was like, it's not that just because he was the clone, it's because he's not only the clone, but now he's the editor of the Daily Planet. He's dating Lois. Like, he gets inserted into everything. It's not like this is this new character that comes up, because you would think that Lex would hire this guy like as an assistant or something to keep him around him.
Yeah, I know. Our mutual friend, Zach Moore, I think this is one of his least favorite characters in the entire show. I never felt that strongly about him. And I think my fandom of the OC kind of carried me through a little bit of the Grant Gabriel stuff. But the one thing, and I think I felt this even at the time, and especially after rewatching some of this, like, that revelation, it just doesn't have the weight that it should. It almost feels like an after. Like, this is crazy. Like, this is a clone of your brother.
I think you hit it right there. It feels like an afterthought of maybe like, okay, this character is not working out. Because I'm going to do a Smallville rewatch sometime in the future, and I'm going to look for the moment where I feel like they decided that, because I wonder if that was the plan from the beginning. But they were like, okay, this character is dying. We have to do something to make this character matter.
And yeah, I would be curious about that as well, how early in the game they had that idea. And then Lionel embraced, another instance of Lionel's warmth shining upon someone who's not Lex. And Lex has Grant killed. And then there's this scene where Lex goes outside and he just looks up into the heavens and the rain is pouring down and he screams. Look, I don't think this came together the way it could have or the way that they intended. But if we are looking at stepping stones on the way to Lex's ultimate villainy, his killing of the clone of his deceased baby brother, it's something. But yeah, I wish that this had hit harder. All right, so those are the brothers, Lucas and Julian / Grant Gabriel. We have one brother-in-law, Jeff Colby. This is the FBI agent that Lena marries in the Silver Age. He makes only one appearance in Action Comics 317 in 1964. at some point off panel, he dies because by the time we hit Superman Family, that arc from 212 to 214, there's a reference to him having passed away. So to my knowledge, we never get an explanation of it.
This was the one I did not know that I was like, wait, what? He had a brother-in-law as the FBI? I was like, this one kind of shocked me because I was like, I hadn't heard this name. It's like, whoa.
Yeah. So Jeff Colby, the brother-in-law, I mean, not much to say about him other than that he existed and that he knew so this was the whole business was that like Lena had applied to be an FBI agent, but when they did a background check, like they found nothing. And Supergirl felt it was her responsibility to let them know about her familial connection to Lex. So it's like Jeff Colby knew that Lex was Lena's brother, information that even Lena herself didn't know. But anyway, this is the brother-in-law. He makes one appearance. He dies off panel. Okay. We ready for the wives? There's a lot. There's a lot of wives.
Yeah, there is.
So in the Bronze Age, there was this whole recurring story where Lex had this whole other life on the planet Lexor, where he was hailed as a hero. And we talked about this when we did our Lex Through the Ages discussion, and it was very interesting. And at the time, it was new to me, and I thought it was a really interesting facet to his character and to his history. And so on Lexor, he starts this romance with a woman named Ardora and marries her. Unfortunately, she meets a heartbreaking end in Action 544. That's the Bronze Age story where we get Lex in his new look in his battle suit, right? Because Lex goes back to Lexor. He reunites with Ardora. He finds out that she's had a baby, Lex Luthor Jr., and I guess this is sort of conflating a little bit of the wives and children here, but we look at them as a unit here. And Lex is really taken with the idea of being a father, and clearly there's warmth towards his son, but he can't let go of this hatred towards Superman. And long story short, his various machinations with this warsuit of his cause a chain reaction in the planet, and Lexor is destroyed, killing everybody, including his wife and son.
It baffles me when they try to make Lex somewhat of relatable or like redemptive, and then they like take it away from him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the Lexor stories all the way through the finale here in Action 544 really highlight the tragedy of Lex and how he just can't get out of his own way, because it's like, here's a planet where he has everything that he seems to want. Right? He's got the adoration of the populace. He's got this loving wife. He's got this new child. He could pursue his scientific ambitions to no end. And yet he can't let it go. And it ends up being the undoing of this life and all the people on it. So it's really, really heartbreaking. So that's Ardora. Okay. This next one is as deep a cut as there is. And if anyone knows the name Angela Blake, please write in and let me know, because this is so obscure. There was this arc from Action 510 to 512 pre-crisis. And I only just came across it in my research here. And hopefully I can remember enough of the details of this because it's a wild story. But basically, Superman is rescuing this young woman, Angela Blake, and Lex has Superman in his sights with a ray gun of some sort, but he hesitates. For some reason, he doesn't pull the trigger because he doesn't want to risk harming this woman. And he can't figure out, like, well, what is it about this woman? And so he tracks her down and he investigates her. It's Angela Blake. And it turns out she's dying of this terminal disease, but Lex takes her and cures her and seemingly turns over this new leaf and has become a force for good and becomes friends and allies with Superman. And marries Angela Blake with Superman there as his best man. After the wedding ceremony, and I didn't realize this was a tradition, but Angela says to Superman, okay, it's time for the best man to kiss the bride. Which, again, didn't realize was a thing.
Nope.
And when they do, they both disappear. And Lex can't figure out what's going on. And then Lex's robots take him away and restore Lex's memories. Because here's the thing. It turns out all of this has been a plot by Lex to get Superman. And Lex erased his own memory so that things would be able to play out. And what we find out is that he had found this woman, Angela Blake. He had taken her. He had cloned her. He had killed her. And he had cured the clone of this disease. And so she did actually have a disease. That part was true. But so he clones her. The clone is cured of the disease, but the clone, for lack of a more accurate description, essentially the clone's cells were set to detonate at Lex's command. So everything Lex had done was a plot to get Superman kissing this clone with these detonating cells. But Superman was one step ahead and was able to get away before this could happen. I don't know if it was an outright explosion or she was sent to the Phantom Zone or something like that. But the very end of this story is Lex crying over realizing what he had lost. But all to say that Lex was married to a clone of a woman named Angela Blake in the Bronze Age.
Dang. The Bronze Age is my biggest blind spot. That is some heavy stuff.
Yeah.
That is.
So that's a wild deep cut from pre-crisis territory. As we move forward into the post-crisis landscape, in Byrne's Man of Steel, Lois has this line towards Lex about his 8 wives, or she's like, your 7 wives or 8, I can't keep track, something like that. So right from the jump post-crisis, there's this idea Lex has been married a bunch of times. Now, to my knowledge though, where most of these wives go unnamed and unseen. One exception to that is Elizabeth Persk, who we just talked about in our Matrix episode, because she pops up in that 1994 miniseries written by Roger Stern and reaches out to Matrix Supergirl, who's in a relationship with Lex Luthor II at the time, and ultimately ends up taking her on as becomes a mentor to the Matrix Supergirl by the end of that story. And there's a reference in that miniseries to Lex having married her for her social connections, which I just thought was an interesting bit. It's like, yeah, he has all of these wives. It was for a specific reason in each instance.
I mean, that would seem like a very Lex Luthor thing to do.
Yeah. Obviously, I think his most notable wife in the post-crisis comics territory, the Contessa Erica Alexandra del Portenza, who comes in, takes over LexCorp after Lex is off the board. They end up getting married. She gives birth to Lena, and the second Lena is born, Lex has her sedated and locked away.
It's harsh. It's evil. It doesn't surprise me. She is, like you marked here, like a version of her, Erica, was the one that was on Superman and Lois.
Yeah, I think they just call her, or she's referred to as Erica. But yeah, we see her in flashbacks as Lex and Mother arguing over what to do with their daughter. So yeah, we get a version of her on Superman and Lois. But yeah, I mean, she was a notable character in those Triangle era comics, the Contessa. There was that end of the century hardcover original graphic novel that Stuart Immonen did, where you find out she's immortal. But she does ultimately meet her end after Lex becomes president. Like, he orders a missile strike on her base of operations, and that's it for her.
It's crazy how the depth of Lex will go to just to eliminate wives, family, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, this was clearly purely transactional for Lex, and he needed her because she had control of the company initially when he returned. And I guess he was looking to produce an heir, and she served that function. So yeah, it's incredibly cool. But I mean, I liked her because she was able to until the end, I mean, hold her own against Lex. And it was kind of cool to see a kind of a female equivalent of Lex, who became this romantic partner of his. So that's really the kind of the comic book side as far as wives. But then in other media, in the first episode of Lois and Clark season 2, we have Ariana Carlin, the ex-wife of Lex, who inserts herself as the Daily Planet psychiatrist. And she also creates this doppelganger of Lois to cause problems. And she also is, maybe her biggest claim to fame is she's working with Dr. Gretchen Kelly. They retrieve Lex's body, which has been cryogenically frozen, and start the process that will ultimately result in his resurrection. So she had a small but important part to play. But yeah, she comes in right after Lex has jumped to his death at the end of season 1.
I like that last name there.
I mean, I'm assuming that was a deliberate homage to longtime editor Mike Carlin. But yeah, Ariana Carlin. And then moving forward a few years on Smallville, Lex had a number of wives across the show. And
bro,
yeah,
that's not a joke.
I mean, in season 2 alone, at the beginning of the season, he marries Desiree Atkins. Of course, it turns out she's using her she's a meteor freak. She's using her pheromones to influence him. She puts the moves on Clark. It's a whole thing. This is the episode where Clark develops his heat vision, which is triggered by sexual arousal. So he marries Desiree. Presumably that gets annulled because it was under false pretenses. But then at the end of the season, he marries Dr. Helen Bryce, who I thought was a great character until the writers clearly changed their mind between seasons 2 and 3 and revealed that she was the scheming gold digger who tried to kill Lex. And it's like, what?
Yeah, I think, man, that's one that hit hard because it didn't feel right. But I think that's another way of showing that Lex, if you give him someone to love him, we're not gonna get where we want him to be.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things. It's like, not that I would have expected them to live happily ever after, but it was a bummer because it just felt like that came out of, like, her turn came out of nowhere there. But pour one out for Helen Bryce. And then, I mean, most notably, Lana Lang. They get married in the season 6 episode Promise. He faked her pregnancy. He made her think that she was pregnant.
I think, let's look at what we just learned here. He'd been burned twice. He was guarded and he wanted insurance.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've issued this thesis before. I'll reissue it here quickly, but I really feel like you look at the Lex on Smallville. I think the moment where he took the fall for his mom over the killing of Julian, I think that was the last truly pure, selfless, loving act that he performed for his mother. And I think after that, it's not that there was never any good in anything that he did, but I think even when there was love, or even when there was something that he was trying to do that was good, I think there was always something else, some ulterior motive, some agenda, some insecurity attached to it. And I think in terms of this relationship with Lana and essentially tricking her into marrying him by faking this pregnancy, illustrate that.
Yeah. He had to have something that was like, ensure that you'll stay with me.
On the wives front, to recap here, we have Ardora on Lexor in the Bronze Age. We have Angela Blake, or her clone, rather, in this really odd, obscure arc. We have approximately 8 wives in the post-crisis era, mostly unnamed. An exception is Elizabeth Persk, who becomes a mentor to Matrix Supergirl. We have the Contessa. And then on the TV side, we have Ariana Carlin on Lois and Clark. I guess worth noting, almost Lois on Lois and Clark, but they don't actually get married. And then on Smallville, we have Desiree Atkins, Helen Bryce, and Lana Lang, all as wives of Lex Luthor. Okay, ready for the children?
Yeah.
Well, the first one I already mentioned, Lex Luthor Jr., the son on Lexor. He only makes that one appearance in Action 544. But like I said, I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking that Lex could have had everything he wanted, but he just couldn't get over himself. Out of his own way, I should say. So that's pre-crisis. And then post-crisis, Jerry White.
That is the one that's the hard one. That is the one that is a deep cut, but it also, that's where you have to go back to Perry White being more of Lex's contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
And because that is hard, but I think that's really good storytelling. I mean, both on Perry's side, Alice and Lex, because Perry chooses to raise him as his own and accept him.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, that's the thing. So yeah, he's the product of this affair that Lex and Alice had while Perry was reporting overseas. And if we go back to that World of Metropolis miniseries by Byrne, I mean, Lex really manipulated Alice and really kept her in the dark about Perry's whereabouts and his return, and really used the situation to his advantage. But I think that other than that hospital confrontation scene where it comes out that Lex is the biological father, I think the thing that really stands out is when Lex learns that Jerry has died, and you actually see him mourning.
I like it because I like seeing that there's I don't like there being no humanity in Lex. That's not an interesting character. But when there's those cracks, and that goes back to our Lena discussion, I think it shows that he still is a person on some level. He still has emotion.
Yeah. Look, I've made it clear, my feelings towards the post-crisis Lex, especially under Byrne. I like the whole reinvention as the evil businessman, but it ultimately just kind of felt a little bit too one note for me, especially in terms of just how sadistic he could be and all of that. And so to see a moment like this, right, where something's getting through to him, like you're saying, that little crack in the armor really goes a long way. So that really stands out. The next one doesn't really count, but we'll just mention Lex Luthor II, but it's actually Lex himself, of course, in a cloned body, posing as his own son.
Which is the best way to, how do we bring character back and de-age him? He's his own child. All right. Awesome.
And then, of course, Lena Luthor, who we already mentioned her, born to Lex and Contessa. And I mean, most notably, we've talked about this a lot, but Lex sacrifices her at the end of the Y2K storyline in exchange for control of the Brainiac 13 technology. And she's aged up and becomes an agent of Brainiac 13. But at the conclusion of Our Worlds at War, Superman is able to retrieve the infant Lena and return her to Lex. And this classic moment that I'm always quoting where he says, "We're small men in a large universe, and stop trying to be a god and just try to be a man." It's such a powerful moment between these two guys as he returns the baby. And then not too long after that, Lena disappeared, seemingly gone into continuity limbo forever until Josh Williamson brought her back as a teenager who had been sequestered on this island with Leticia Luthor, her grandmother. And now she's back in play. She's a regular supporting member in the Sophie Campbell Supergirl book. It's amazing.
Yep. It is amazing. And I think if I could just get a line of dialogue that she was named after her aunt, I'd be happy. Because then I could have my cake and eat it too.
So at that point in the continuity during the Triangle era, Lex named the baby Lena to honor a foster sister he had who was killed by their abusive foster father. But you do bring up an interesting question in the current continuity, because we talked about that New 52 Rebirth version of Lena who goes evil and becomes Ultra Woman. To my knowledge, I mean, she's been off the board now for a good few years and certainly hasn't been seen or heard from since Lena the daughter returned. But in theory, Lena the sister is still out there. So I'll be curious what happens.
In my head canon, I like the idea that the only person that Lex Luthor ever loved was his sister. So when he had a daughter, he named her after his sister.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a great way that maybe the one thing is Luthor thought she died and she hasn't. She didn't die.
So we have Lena, and then on Lois and Clark, it's after John Shea has left the show, but we meet two of Lex's kids. One is Jackson Xavier in the Virtually Destroyed episode. And so Jackson Xavier, he works at one of Lex's companies, but he was always denied the Luthor name and a public acknowledgement on Lex's part. And this is his sole appearance. And at the end of it, we see his head on a computer screen. It's like he's been lost into the virtual reality world. And more notable on the Lois and Clark front is Lex Luthor Jr., a.k.a. Mr. Smith, the disfigured son of Lex, who was raised in seclusion and uses Leslie Luckabee as his stand-in before his true identity is revealed. And we get this from Leslie to Lois, but it seems like it's an actual story that actually happened to Lex Jr., where his father visited him just one time when he was growing up and asked him just one question: "Do you believe that the sins of the father are visited upon the son?" And he tells his son, "You better hope that's not the case." And that seemed to be the extent of their actual interactions with each other. But we talked about this last year when we went through Lois and Clark, but that Lex Files 3-parter, I think it's a standout. It's a highlight for me of season 4. I remember it fondly from being a kid, and revisiting it was a lot of fun. So yeah, so Lex Luthor Jr. on Lois and Clark. And just one more on the television front, which is Dr. Elizabeth Del Portenza on Superman and Lois in the 4th and final season. Lois tracks her down, gets her to come to Smallville to try to talk some sense into her father, and can't. I mean, it's one of these things. A theme, I guess, that Lex can't get out of his own way. Like, this daughter is willing to take him back if he can let go his quest for revenge, and he can't.
I don't think that's part of Lex's character. Hey, there you go. There's another family member. She's pregnant with Lex's grandchild.
And there you go. Yeah. We never get the name, but yeah, exactly. And then I guess the biggest one is Connor Kent. So we talked all about Connor and this retcon to his history, because initially it was not the intention that he was the biological clone of Superman and Lex, right? There was for a while, it seemed like his human DNA came from Paul Westfield of Cadmus. And then Jeff Johns entered the scene, and we had this revision that half the DNA came from Superman, half came from Lex. Our pal Martin Gray on Patreon asks, "One relative I'd rather not be a relative is Superboy Con-El. The revamped Jeff Johns origin making him half Clark and half Lex was just too neat and a bit obvious. So my question is, how do you feel about that?"
My feel about that is I feel like there's a great Connor story out there that's not been tapped, where Connor finds a way to basically use the best of both and basically rises above both of them. Basically, he has all of Superman's powers and abilities, and becomes a better Superman in some ways. But then he has all of Lex's invention and mind and scientific mind and is able to better the world. So it's like he becomes what the world could have been if Superman and Lex had worked together.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's interesting because it's like, I think a lot of times it's spun as, the potential danger of having some kind of influence from Lex. But I kind of like what you're saying. Like, well, there are actually positive attributes that Lex possesses that maybe that could help Connor prevail or something like that. I mean, to Martin's question, I've made my peace with this. I mean, there's a big part of me that really does still gravitate towards that initial iteration of Connor. He wasn't Connor at the time, but of Superboy who we meet in Reign of the Supermen. And I don't disagree with Martin that it does feel a bit obvious that half the DNA would come from Lex, but to me, that's not a fatal flaw. I think it does open up storytelling possibilities like we saw in that Teen Titans storyline. I remember that moment where we had that revelation at the end of the first issue of Titans, and it hit. And I think it was, like I said, when we talked about Connor, whenever the character is adapted or his history is retold or whatever the case, I do hope that initial version of him is represented. I feel like a lot of times we just jump right into clone of Superman and Lex, and I get it. I do always want to kind of hold up that first version and kind of show that transition, that revelation. I think that's important, but no, I'm on board with that.
Cool.
And I can never pass up an opportunity to mention this, but Project Alien Farm, God damn it. During that New Krypton era, Lex was experimenting with combining his DNA with Kaluan DNA. Project Alien Farm never went anywhere. So that's a dangling thread out there.
That could be like a whole planet full of Lex children.
And then this last one, this really does fall into the category of alternate continuity, but I suspect someone will reach out to me about this. So I recognize in the Superman Beyond universe, there's a Lucinda who allegedly is a daughter of Lex. I've not delved into that corner of the DCU, but that's out there.
Me neither.
All right. So recapping the children, Lex Luthor Jr. on Lexor, Jerry White, the product of this affair with Alice White, Lex Luthor II, really Lex in his own clone body, Lena, Jackson Xavier on Lois and Clark, Lex Luthor Jr. on Lois and Clark, Elizabeth on Superman and Lois, Connor Kent, aka Superboy, this Project Alien Farm that maybe one day we'll get an answer to, and Lucinda in the Superman Beyond universe. Okay, we're nearing the end here. Relatively short category, but nieces and nephews. So, Nasty Luthor, who we've referenced already, she made about a baker's dozen appearances in the Bronze Age, starting in Adventure Comics 397 in 1970, where at the behest of Uncle Lex, she goes to Stanhope College. She forms an all-girl gang, Nasties, to cause trouble and try to draw out Supergirl and uncover her secret identity. And she becomes like a bit of a recurring nemesis. She is convinced that Linda Danvers is Supergirl, but she can't prove it, but she's following her around. And when Linda moves and takes a job as a camera operator, like Nasty follows her and gets a job there too. So
that's obsession. That's a Luthor thing. That's a Luthor trait though.
I know. And then we got, she got a modern spin in All-Star Superman. So the way I look at Nasty, I think that she served a valid function in those Adventure Comic stories. At the same time, kind of like Lucas, I feel like she was added rather recklessly. And I feel like there could have been some version of a story where Lena Thorol is exposed to black kryptonite and an evil dark side of her comes out and it's Nasty. Like, I don't think we needed another character here is my point, but she's out there.
I think you're onto it right there.
And then much more recently, we had Lori, who was the daughter of the wheelchair-bound Lena in that Boy of Steel arc from Jeff Johns and Francis Maniple post-Infinite Crisis. And then she was a supporting character in that Jeff Lemire solo Superboy series that ran for about a year right before the New 52. And, she became part of the crew and all of that. But Lori Luthor.
Cool. I remember her.
So moving over to the nephews, we have Val Colby, who is the son of Lena and Jeff in the pre-crisis landscape, just made a few appearances as well. Notably, he had psychokinetic powers that he got from a space gem that Lex had secretly sent him. And Lex theorized that Val had inherited Lena's ESP and that the space rock kind of activated something. And so he had more than ESP. He had these psychokinetic powers, which of course makes me think of the Matrix Supergirl we get post-crisis, that psychokinesis. But yeah, so he just makes a few appearances starting in Adventure Comics 387 in 1969. And then I suppose the most famous, or the more famous, because we only have two, the more famous nephew is Lenny, played by John Cryer in Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, the son of an unnamed sister here.
I'll say, yeah, we don't ever get where his paternity falls from.
But yeah, the whole Uncle Lex, man, I don't know how much mileage you got out of Lenny in Superman 4.
It was like, it's weird that they're like, okay, we're gonna give him a nephew without any history because we don't have he doesn't have a beautiful woman by his side now. So we'll give him an annoying nephew.
Yeah, look, we had been in the realm. Of course, we had Otis, we'd had Miss Tessmacher. So, the idea of giving him kind of a goofy sidekick henchman is not so out of left field. Making it a familial connection, it puts a little bit of a different spin on it. But yeah, my enjoyment only went so far of Lenny. So as far as nieces and nephews, we have Nasty, Lori, Val, and Lenny. And then our last category we already hit, which was distant cousins. And that's Jimmy Olsen and his siblings, Julian and Janie.
And I really think that the interesting thing is, if you looked at the family tree by crises, like this is Luthor family tree pre, this is post, this, infinite, and then modern, and then like the TV versions, I think is the most interesting way of looking at it, because however you cluster those up, what does that say about the Luthor of that era or that point? Especially like we were talking about on Smallville, how it's like we took the character of Lex and then split him and gave part of his story to Lionel, part over here. And what does Lex look like with more siblings? What does Lex look like with parents? It's like, what is your preferred version of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think overall, like I've been saying, I think I prefer a relatively constrained family tree. And if and when we're going to add a branch to it or return to one of these branches, more specifically, that's already been established, I think when it can really highlight, explain, amplify some aspect of Lex, I think there can be value there. And or when you can really create a character who stands on her own. And that's where I do think characters like Tess on Smallville and Lena on the Supergirl TV show, they are especially interesting to me because they are essentially stand-ins for Lex. Very much so on Smallville. Like they lost their actor playing Lex, so they brought Tess in. And similarly on Supergirl, yes, we'd ultimately bring Lex into the picture, but that wasn't until much later. It was really like this was the Luthor, along with Lillian, but this was our main Luthor representative. And I think there's a risk of it just feeling derivative of Lex. But I think both of those shows did something distinct with those characters and allowing them to achieve goodness and redemption. I thought was an interesting angle to explore. So when you can do something like that, like really make them stand on their own, then I think there can be value there too. Well, that's our all media Luthor family tree, a larger family tree than maybe folks expected. But
oh yeah, they probably like, oh, Lex just got leading it, right? And wait, there wasn't that one on that one show. Wait, Lenny. Oh man, there's more than I thought.
Yeah, there's more. That was probably my biggest takeaway as I put this together. So I thank you for joining me. I hope that everyone enjoyed. Tyler, what would you like to share with folks about Krypton Report?
Just check out Krypton Report wherever you get your podcasts or wherever you get. We're on. Usually, all the podcasts go to YouTube as well. So if you just like to check YouTube, we're there on all your favorite social media platforms, and just see what we're up to. Always talking something super.
Cool. Well, I hope everyone will check that out. I thank you. I thank you, audience. Keep tuning in as a Supergirl fan journey continues. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the show and receive exclusive content by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Rewards include our DCU spinoff podcast, advanced listens, sponsorship opportunities, and more. My sincere thanks to all patrons. Please rate and review the podcast via your platform of choice, subscribe so that you never miss an episode, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. By popular demand, Digging for Kryptonite merch is available at our TeePublic store. Visit the link in the show notes to get your DFK shirts, hats, mugs, and more. Flat Squirrel Podcast is also home to Lighting the Bat Signal, a Batman fan journey. which applies the signature digging for kryptonite approach to the Dark Knight, as well as another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, now in its final year covering the classic George Reeves series. Subscribe today. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Key art by Isaiah Simmons and theme music by Dan Pritchard.